The first time I died, the current did it. The same force I'd spent my whole childhood learning to coax through a wire and into a little light. The thing I once commanded, bent to my will, made obey, came up out of a frayed cord on a cheap job in a gray building and stopped me cold in half a second, 32 years old, alone, a brilliant pair of hands wasted on work that asked nothing of them. A flash, the smell of it, and then the dark. The builder killed by the very thing she'd been born to master. And the last thing in my mind, before the light went out, was a light I'd switched on, a small handmade lamp, the first thing I ever built that actually worked, glowing in my 9-year-old hands like I'd caught a piece of the sun. And then the last thing I'd ever unbuilt, a project I broke on purpose, the finest thing I had ever made, sabotaged in front of the judges with my own hands, because a woman I loved like a mother sat me down and told me, gently, that her real daughter needed to win more than I did. Here is the cruelty of it, the thing I carried out of that dark and across into a second life. I had a gift. Not a kid who was handy, I mean the real thing, the rare thing, I could build. I could look at a pile of parts and see the working machine inside it the way a sculptor sees the figure in the stone. I understood how things fit and flowed and held together, how current wanted to move and how to make it serve, how to take an idea out of my head and turn it, with my hands, into a thing that ran. And I loved it more than I loved anything, because building was the one place in the whole world where I was powerful and where the world was honest, both at once. A built thing tells you the truth. It works or it doesn't. The circuit closes or it doesn't. The motor turns or it doesn't. And it doesn't care who you are, or whose kid you are, or whether anyone loves you. It only cares whether you got it right. For a lonely kid with a cold house and a hungry heart, that honesty was a kind of mercy. The world of people was a maze of conditions I could never quite satisfy. The world of building just opened to anyone who'd do the work, and I did the work, and it gave me, in return, the only certainty I had, a thing I made, that ran. And I threw it away. I spent the back half of my first life with my hands idle and my gift unused, guarding a heart I'd taught never to trust warmth again, and died young on a gray job in a gray building, killed by the current I'd once commanded, because a woman who gave me the only mothering I ever knew used it, on the one day it mattered, to make me break my own best work. And then I opened my eyes, and the project wasn't broken. It was whole, in front of me on the table, my hands clean and quick and 9 years older than they'd ever be again, and I was 17, the morning of the fair, the build still good, the light still in it. Let me tell you who I was, because you can't understand the size of what I broke unless you understand what building meant to me and what it is to be a child starving for warmth in a house that hasn't got any. My mother was alive. I want to be clear about that because it's a particular kind of cold, worse in some ways than the clean grief of a mother who's died. My mother was alive and present and unreachable, a woman worn down to nothing by work and disappointment, who kept a roof over us and the lights on and had simply, somewhere along the way, run out of whatever it is that lets a parent be warm. She wasn't cruel. She was just gone while standing in the room, a closed door in human shape, and I grew up in the particular hunger of a child who is fed and clothed and never once held, who learns early that warmth is a thing other families have, and hers does not. And into that cold house, I brought building. I built things for company. I taught myself, alone, from library books and broken radios people threw out, soldering on the kitchen table while my mother worked her shifts, and the first time I made a little lamp light up with my own hands, current flowing where I'd sent it, the bulb glowing, a thing I'd made out of nothing, working, I felt something I never felt from a person. I felt that I had made warmth. I'd made light. And it was mine, and it couldn't be taken back or turned cold, because the circuit didn't have moods. I want to be specific about that because it's the whole of who I was before the world got its hands on me. A person can disappoint you 1,000 ways. Go quiet when you need them. Run out of love. Decide today you don't count. I learned all of that before I was 10. But a circuit never did. A circuit was the most reliable thing in my life and the most honest and the most fair because it asked only one thing of me, that I understand the truth of it. And if I did, it gave me back exactly what I'd built. Every single time, no moods, no conditions, no warmth withheld to teach me a lesson. I'd sit at that kitchen table in a cold, quiet house and build, and the building never once made me feel like I was too much or not enough. It just opened, the way the world of making always opens, to anyone willing to learn how things actually work. And the more I learned, the more I understood that I wasn't just escaping the cold. I was making something the cold couldn't touch. Every lamp I lit, every motor I got turning, every little machine I coaxed into running was a small warm certainty in a house that had none, a thing I made that loved me back the only way a made thing can, which is by working. I was rich in a currency no one in that house could see, and growing richer every night at a kitchen table, while staying the loneliest girl I knew. And here's the thing about a self you build with your own hands alone, out of nothing because you had to. It is the most yours of anything a person can own, and so it is the most unbearable thing in the world to be asked to break. A kid handed a gift can set it down. A kid who built her whole self out of circuits at a kitchen table because no one would hold her cannot break that self without breaking the only proof she ever made that she was worth something. Remember the little light. Remember the cold house and the hungry kid who learned to build warmth because no one would give it to her. It's the heart of everything I broke and everything I came back to build. The build was the soul of it, and I mean the moment a thing first works, the moment of truth, when you close the last connection and throw the switch and find out whether the world inside your head matches the world on the table. That instant is the purest thing I know. Not the planning, not the making, but the test, the throwing of the switch, the binary honest verdict. It runs or it doesn't, and there's no charm and no favor and no name that changes it, only whether you understood the truth of the thing well enough to make it real. I lived for that instant. It was where I was most myself, most powerful, most free, because in that instant I was not the cold house kid begging for warmth. I was a person who had made a true thing, and the thing proved itself, and no one could argue with a circuit that closed. Remember the switch. Remember the moment of truth. Remember a thing that works. They're where this whole story is built, and they're what I broke, and they're what I came back to make. And then there was Claudia, and I learned that some people give a starving child warmth the way you fatten a thing you mean, one day, to use. Claudia was the mother of my friend Daphne, and I need you to understand the exact shape of this betrayal, because it's not the betrayal of a cold parent, which a child half expects. It's the betrayal of a warm one, which is worse, because you never see it coming, because you've staked your whole hungry heart on the warmth being real. Daphne and I had been friends since we were small, two science-minded girls who built and tinkered together, and her house, her warm, bright, full house, with a mother in it who baked and asked about your day and put her hand on your shoulder, became the place I went to feel what I didn't feel at home. And Claudia took me in. She fed me, fussed over me, called me sweetheart, told me I was practically one of her own, let me believe, let me need to believe, that I had found, in her, the mother my own house couldn't give me. And I loved her for it with the bottomless gratitude of a child who's been starving, and I would have done anything, not to lose that warmth, not to be sent back out into the cold. That love, that need, that terror of losing the one warm place I'd ever found, it was the foundation everything stood on, and it was the exact thing she used to make me break my own work. Because Daphne was Claudia's real daughter, and Daphne is the hinge the whole thing turns on, so let me tell you what she was. Daphne was a good kid and a decent young scientist, but she was not me, not at building, not even close, because the gift I had was the rare kind and Daphne had the ordinary good kind, and the difference showed the moment you put us both at a workbench. What Daphne had that I didn't was Claudia, a mother who would engineer her daughter's every advantage, managed her every project, hovered and corrected and arranged, a mother so invested in her daughter's success that the success had quietly stopped being Daphne's at all. Daphne had never once been allowed to find out what she could do on her own, because her mother had never once let her stand on her own. Remember Daphne. She's not the villain. She was a kid loved too hard in the wrong direction, who genuinely believed she'd earned what her mother engineered for her, who had no idea what Claudia arranged in the dark. She was the daughter the whole scheme was for, and the reason I was asked to break my own best work. There were two people who saw me clear, the way Claudia pretended to and didn't. The first was Ms. Okafor, my science and shop teacher, an engineer who'd left industry to teach, a woman with grease under her nails and no patience for nonsense, who had recognized my gift the first week and fed it ever since with scrap parts and hard questions, and a warmth that asked for nothing back. Ms. Okafor's warmth was the real kind, the unconditional kind, the kind that didn't keep a ledger, which is exactly why I couldn't see at the time how counterfeit Claudia's was, because I had nothing to compare it to until later. Remember, Ms. Okafor. She saved my second life with one sentence. And the second was Milo, my friend, a fellow maker, a tinkering kid who built rockets and ruined his mother's blender for parts and had my back at every workbench, and whom I lost in my first life and came back for in my second. Now I have to tell you about the science fair, because it's the center of everything. It was the big one, a major regional fair that fed into the national circuit, with judges who mattered and a first prize that meant a scholarship, a real one, the kind that could take a cold house kid with no money to a real engineering program and a real future. For most of the kids, it was a competition. For me, it was the door. The scholarship was my only way out of the small gray life that was otherwise waiting for me. The recognition was the proof that the gift I'd built alone at a kitchen table was real. And somewhere underneath, in the part of me that never stopped being 9 and hungry, it was my shot at finally being seen, at making someone, anyone, proud. And I'd built a project that year that was genuinely extraordinary, a thing I'd poured myself into, that worked beautifully, that everyone who saw it knew would win. And that, of course, was the problem. Because Daphne had built a perfectly fine project that would place respectably, and Claudia could not bear for her real daughter to stand on a stage and lose first place to the cold house girl she'd taken in out of kindness. The night before the fair, in my first life, Claudia sat me down at her warm kitchen table for the conversation she'd been building toward. She made me cocoa, the way she always did, and she put her warm hand over mine, and she used the soft voice, the mother's voice, the voice I'd have crawled across broken glass to keep hearing, and she said, "Sweetheart, I want to talk to you about tomorrow, and I want you to hear it from someone who loves you like her own." And my whole starving heart opened toward her. It's about Daphne, about the fair. You know how much this means to her, how hard she's worked, how much she needs a win of her own, and you know how things are at her age, how fragile it all is. And here's the truth I can say because I love you. You're more gifted than she is. You always have been. But you, sweetheart, you're going to be fine no matter what. That gift of yours will carry you anywhere. You don't need this the way she does. Daphne needs this one thing. So here's what I'm asking, as the woman who's been a mother to you when you needed one. And here she did the thing, the soft pivot, the warmth turned into a blade. Bomb it tomorrow. Don't show your best. Let your project fail in the judging just enough, so that Daphne can take first. Do it for her. Do it for me. Do it for this family that loves you. And you'll always, always have us. And then the ask, the one that is the title of my whole story, delivered with the terrible tenderness of a woman dressing her own daughter's coronation up as the price of a starving child's belonging. Bomb the science fair so my daughter takes first. My daughter. I want you to hear those 2 words because they were the whole knife. I sat there at her warm kitchen table, a cold house girl who had staked her entire hungry heart on this woman's love, and the woman I'd let myself believe was a mother to me looked at me and said my daughter and meant Daphne, laid it bare in 2 words, exactly where I stood. There was one daughter in that house, and it was not me. The warmth, the cocoa, the practically one of my own, it had all been real enough to need and false enough to spend, and the moment her real daughter's first place was at stake, the borrowed daughter was the one who could be asked to lose. And the deeper cruelty, the one I'd understand fully only when I was grown and dead and reborn, was the specific shape of what she asked. She didn't ask me to lose a contest. She asked me to break my own work with my own hands, to take the truest thing I had, the one place I made warmth and made light, and made things that were honestly, unarguably mine, and sabotage it, ruin it, make it fail on purpose so her daughter could shine in the space where I went dark. She was asking the cold house kid who built light because no one would give her warmth to put out her own light, to keep a warmth that was never really hers. And the promise folded inside it, "You'll always have us," was the lie every conditional love tells, the bait that buys the surrender. Because a child who'll break her own best work to keep your warmth has just proven the warmth was a leash, and you don't keep a thing like that out of love. You keep it because it's useful. And Claudia had found the one lever a starving heart has no defense against, the warmth itself, the only mothering I'd ever known, the terror of being sent back into the cold, and she used it to make me break my own light. And I did it. God forgive the girl I was, but understand her. I did it. The next day at the fair, in front of the judges and the crowd, with a scholarship on the line, I bombed it. I'd built a thing that worked beautifully, and at the moment of judging, the moment of truth, I sabotaged my own demonstration, loosened a connection I knew was load-bearing, let the build fail at the switch, stood there while the thing I'd made so carefully sat dead on the table, and the judges frowned and moved on. I broke my own light on purpose, in public, with my own hands. And the worst part, the part that followed me into 15 gray years, is that I knew, in the exact moment the circuit stayed open and the thing didn't run, that I was killing something, that I was taking the one true honest place I had, the one thing that was unarguably mine, and ruining it to keep a warmth that was never mine at all, and teaching myself the lesson that would run my whole life. That my gift was dangerous, that warmth was conditional, that the way to be loved was to break my own work and go dark. And Daphne took first, and Claudia beamed at her real daughter, and folded me into a warm hug that I now understood was a receipt, and I, the best builder in that whole hall, went home to my cold house with my dead project in my arms and my own light put out. And Claudia did not always have me. Of course she didn't. That's the part that finished me. The warmth cooled, slowly, over the months that followed, the invitations thinned, the cocoa stopped, the one of my own quietly retired, because I'd served my purpose. Daphne had her first place, and a borrowed daughter who's done her job is just a cold house girl again, and you don't keep feeding one of those out of love. The promise had been the precise price of my surrender, never meant to be kept. And the door I'd broken, the scholarship, the recognition, the way out, the future, closed for good because a kid whose project bombs at the big fair doesn't get the scholarship, and there was no other one coming for a girl with no money and no warm family to fall back on. The future I'd had no other way to reach went dark with my project. There was no other door, and the damage did not stay contained to one project. That's the thing about being taught at the formative moment, that warmth is conditional, and your gift is the price. It doesn't stay one broken project. It becomes the shape of you. I had learned 2 lessons that day, twin poisons, and I built my whole life on both without ever once questioning them. I want to stay in that ruin a moment, because the way the 2 poisons spread is the part nobody warns you about, the part that's worse than one lost scholarship. A wound to a grown woman stays mostly where you put it. A wound to a kid, at the exact age she's deciding what she's allowed to want and who she's allowed to trust, gets built into the foundation, and everything she becomes after is built crooked on top of it. The first poison was about my hands. I had stood at a table and broken my own best work in public and watched it get me nowhere, and the lesson my 17-year-old self drew from it was not that woman was cruel. It was your light is dangerous, your light costs you. The safe thing is to go dark before someone makes you. And so when I built something good after that, anything, I felt not pride but a flicker of dread, the kitchen table warning. Don't shine too bright. Don't be too much. Someone will make you put it out. And I'd pull back, dim it, leave the gift in its box. I never became the engineer I was born to be, because reaching for what my hands could do felt like the prelude to being made to break it again. And so I let the gift go idle and drifted into gray work that used my hands for nothing, fixing other people's broken cheap things on cheap jobs, the rarest pair of hands in any room carefully, deliberately doing nothing that mattered. The second poison was worse because it was about my heart, and it froze the part of me that had been doing all the building. I had learned, from the warmest person I'd ever known, that warmth is bait, that love comes with a bill, that the people who hold you closest are the ones fattening you to spend, that the moment you stop being useful the table is taken away. And so I never let anyone close again. I guarded that hungry heart with everything I had, kept everyone at the cold arm's length my mother had taught me and Claudia had confirmed, turned down the warmth that real people tried to offer because I'd learned, on the one day it counted, that warmth was a trap that ended in a bill. The cold house kid who'd built light precisely because she was starving for it spent her whole adult life refusing the light when it was finally offered free, because she'd been taught that reaching for it got you used. So I lived alone and untrusting and unwarmed, fed and clothed and self-sufficient and frozen, exactly the closed door my mother had been, having become the very thing the cold house made, because the one time I dared to need warmth, it had handed me a bill I was still paying. And at 32, on a gray electrical job that asked nothing of the gift I'd buried, and everything of the carelessness of a person who'd stopped paying attention to her own life, a frayed cord and a wet floor, and a careless half-second sent the current up through me and stopped my heart, the builder killed by the very force she'd once commanded, alone, unwarmed, her hands long idle, her light long out. There was no one in the gray building to find me for a while. And the last thing in my mind, before the dark, was a little lamp glowing in my 9-year-old hands at a kitchen table, and then a project I broke on purpose, my own best work, ruined with my own hands at a warm kitchen woman's word. And then I opened my eyes, and the project was whole on the table in front of me, my hands clean and quick and young again, and I was 17, the morning of the fair, the build still good, the light still in it. I did not cry, and I'll be straight with you about that because the soft version has me weeping over my project, and the real version is harder and stranger. What moved through me, sitting there with my whole build intact under my hands, was the clean, total clarity of a maker who has broken her own best work, put out her own light, and just been handed, against every law of God and time, the chance to throw the switch for real. The strangeness of it nearly stopped my hands that first moment, because nobody tells you what it is to be your grown self and your young self at once, in the same body, at the table where it all went wrong. I looked at my hands, and they were a 17-year-old's hands, clean and quick, not yet idle, not yet scarred by 15 years of fixing other people's junk. I looked at the project in front of me, and it was whole, the thing I'd pour myself into and then ruin in a few hours' time in another life. Every connection still solid, the whole machine alive and waiting. I could hear the hall filling up beyond the lab, the other kids, the world I knew the whole future of. The broken light, the withdrawn warmth, the frozen heart, the gray job, the current. I knew all of it, carried all of it, in a body that hadn't lived a day of it. For one strange beat I half expected, every time I blinked, to wake back on the gray job with the frayed cord in my hand and the dark coming up. But the build was real and solid under my fingers, and when I traced the connection I'd sabotaged in another life it held firm, and slowly the strangeness settled into the one hard certainty underneath, that this was not a dream and not a mercy I'd earned, just a window thrown open one more time, the morning of the fair, the build still good, and that I was not going to spend it dazed. I had a switch to throw. More than that, I had a light to take back out of the dark I'd put it in, and a heart I'd frozen that didn't have to freeze, and one chance to let my own work shine where I'd broken it. And underneath the clarity lower down was something close to the old joy, because I could feel my hands again, the gift, the way a build wanted to come together, the certainty of a thing that would run, flooding back after 15 gray years of idle hands. I checked the connection I'd sabotaged in a few hours' time in another life, and it was solid, and the whole machine was alive and waiting in front of me, and I nearly threw the switch right there just to watch it run, because I'd spent a whole gray life with my hands fixing other people's junk, and now I was 17, and my own true work was whole under my fingers, ready to prove itself. Even if the scholarship had been gone forever, I think I'd have wept just for that, for the build, for the hands, for the light I'd thought I'd put out for good. The revenge, whatever it became, was always going to run second to that. The first thing was that I had my hands back and my light. Everything else came from refusing, this time, to break it. The hours before the fair were strange and vivid, and the strangest part was all of them being alive and unwritten again. Claudia, warm and conditional, and not yet exposed. Daphne, managed and oblivious and not yet beaten. Ms. Okafor somewhere setting up the hall with grease on her hands. Milo, who'd had my back, whom I'd lost in another life. I moved through that morning the way you'd retrace the steps of the worst thing you ever did, finding every place the first telling went wrong. I found Ms. Okafor first, at her bench in the lab. Not for help with the build, for something closer to a true thing to hold against a false one. In my first life after I bombed it, Ms. Okafor had known. An engineer that good, who'd watched me build that project from nothing and knew every connection in it, would have seen exactly what I did at the judging. A load-bearing connection that doesn't fail by accident in a build that careful, and something in her had gone quietly, furiously heartbroken, because she'd poured her real warmth into a kid on the belief that the kid would never put out her own light. And she'd watched me do exactly that, and could never prove it or undo it. So in my second life, I went to her and I said, plain, somebody wants me to bomb it today. To let my project fail, so theirs can win. Somebody I love. And Ms. Okafor looked up from her bench with those clear, no-nonsense eyes, the eyes of a woman who'd built real things in the real world and never once broken one to please anybody, and she was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing I carried into every build for the rest of 2 lives. Listen to me, because I'm only going to say it once. A thing you build works, or it doesn't. That's the whole truth of it, and it's the best truth there is, because it's the one truth nobody can buy or beg or love their way around. The circuit closes, or it doesn't. The laws don't care whose daughter you are, or whose feelings get hurt, or who needs the win more. They only care whether you got it right. So you go in there today and you throw your switch and you let your work tell the truth, the way honest work does. Don't you dare break a true thing to make a false one look good. Anybody who asks you to put out your own light to keep their warmth was never giving you warmth, sweetheart. They were giving you a bill. She didn't know she'd just named the exact difference between her warmth and Claudia's. She didn't know she was describing the shape of my death and my resurrection. I never told her, but I've carried it to every workbench since. A thing works or it doesn't. The laws don't care whose daughter you are. Let your work tell the truth, and never break a true thing to make a false one shine. I did not confront Claudia that morning, and people always ask why I didn't expose her the second I woke up knowing what she was. The answer runs underneath this whole story, because a confrontation was a scene, and a scene was a thing Claudia could win easily because she held the warmth and the story and a starving kid's whole need. She was the beloved mother figure, fluent in the language of the generous woman wounded by an ungrateful girl she'd taken in, and any accusation I made would be turned, instantly, into proof that I was jealous, troubled, biting the hand that fed me, and people would believe her, because believing her cost them nothing, and believing me cost them a warm, pleasant story about a kind woman and a lucky girl. The one move she had no answer to was a builder who simply, quietly, was no longer available to break her own work. So I gave her nothing to push against. I was warm. I was the grateful borrowed daughter she expected, and inside I was a sealed circuit she couldn't read, and I let her walk toward the fair certain that the girl she was counting on to bomb it had quietly, permanently, decided to build. And I watched Daphne because Daphne was the managed daughter at the center of it, and I needed to see her clear with my second life eyes. And here's what I saw. A kid who had never once been allowed to find out what she could do. Daphne genuinely believed she was good enough to win, because her mother had spent her whole life arranging the proof, managing her projects, smoothing her path, and, when it came down to it, having the better builder break her own work, all without Daphne ever knowing. She wasn't cruel. She was, in her over-managed way, sweet to me, my actual friend. She was just a girl who had been loved so hard in the wrong direction that she'd never been permitted to stand on her own 2 feet, and so she had no idea they wouldn't hold her. Remember that. It's why her 9th place wasn't just a loss. It was the first honest measurement of her life, the first time her mother's hands weren't on the scale, and a kid can survive that, even be freed by it, the way I'd never been freed from anything. Daphne wasn't the architect. She was the daughter the architect built, and the reason I was told to break my light. And there was Milo. I have to tell you about Milo because in my first life I lost him along with everything else, and some of what I came back for was him. Milo was my friend, a fellow maker, a kid who built model rockets and took apart his mother's blender for the motor and had solder burns on his fingers same as me. The one person in my life who lit up instead of flinched when I talked about a build, who'd sit at a bench with me for hours arguing about how to make a thing work. In my first life, after I bombed that fair, I'd pulled away from Milo the way you pull away from everyone when you've done a thing you're ashamed of, because a maker sees a build, and Milo had seen my project run 100 times in the lab and knew exactly what it was supposed to do. And when it sat dead on the table at the judging, he'd have known. A load-bearing connection doesn't fail by accident in a build that clean, and I couldn't stand to be known by the one person who'd believed in my hands. So I lost him. So in my second life I found him, the morning of the fair, hunched over his own project, and he did the thing he always did, looked up and said, "She's gonna run, right? Tell me she's gonna run. I want to watch the whole hall's jaw drop when you throw that switch." And in my first life I'd given him some flat non-answer, already half decided to break it. This time I looked at him and said, "She's gonna run, Milo. All the way." And Milo grinned the grin of a kid who's about to watch a true thing beat a managed one, and said, "Good. Because everybody who actually builds knows it's you. The only people pretending it's Daphne are the ones who've never seen your work run. Go throw your switch." Out of the mouth of a fellow maker, the whole truth, plainly.
I kept Milo this time.
He was at my bench, solder on his fingers, for the whole of a life that actually had people in it. The day of the fair, before the judging, Claudia found me one last time, exactly as I knew she would, with the ask she'd built toward. She caught me by my table, and she cupped my face in her warm hands, the way she always had, the way I'd ached for my whole cold childhood, and she said, soft, "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. Remember how much Daphne needs this. Be a good girl today, let it go, let her have it, and you'll always have us. You'll always have a place in this family. Do it for me." I looked at her, this woman whose warmth I'd been ready to put out my own light for, and I felt the weight of 2 lives hang on what I said next. And I said, level and clear as a closed circuit, "No, Claudia. I'm building mine today. All the way. I'm throwing my switch and letting my work tell the truth. If Daphne can take first against my best, then she earned it, and I'll hug her and mean it. But I am not breaking my own work with my own hands so that she doesn't have to actually be as good as me." The change that came over her face is a thing I'll remember as long as I can close a circuit. She'd never heard it, not from the grateful borrowed daughter, not without a seam she could widen back into the old warm yes. And the warmth fell off her like a switch thrown, and what was underneath was cold and old and ugly, colder than my own mother had ever been, because my mother's cold was just emptiness and Claudia's was the real thing, calculated. After everything I've done for you? After I took you in when your own mother couldn't be bothered, fed you, treated you like one of my own? This is how you repay this family, by being selfish, by stealing my daughter's moment because your pride can't stand to let her have one thing? I knew it. I always wondered if you were a taker. Go on then. But don't you ever come back to my table. And there it was, at last, the thing under the warmth all along. Not a mother, not love, just a woman who'd fed a starving child to fatten a tool. In my first life that, "Don't ever come back to my table," would have unmade me, because a starving heart will break anything not to be sent back into the cold. But I wasn't only that starving girl anymore. I'd already been sent into the cold. I'd lived a whole frozen life in it, and died alone and unwarmed at the end of it. So I said, level and unafraid, "I was never at your table, Claudia. I was on it. But I'm not breaking my work. If Daphne's good enough to win, she'll do it against my best build. If she can only win when I break mine, then she was never good enough, and you've always known it, and that's the whole reason you're standing here with your hands on a 17-year-old's face. A thing works, or it doesn't. The laws don't care whose daughter she is. Watch mine run." And I turned to my table, and I checked my connections, and I got ready to throw the switch. Here's the part Claudia never understood, the mechanism under the whole thing, and I'll lay it out plain because it's the engine of everything. A science fair is judged on the work, the thing you built, whether it runs, how well it solves what it set out to solve, and the best build, fairly judged, wins, because a circuit that closes is not a matter of opinion. In my first life, by bombing it, I didn't beat Daphne with a bad day. I simply took the best build out of the running. I, whose project would have one going away, broke my own work at the moment of truth, and with the best thing in the hall sitting dead on its table, Daphne's perfectly decent build became the best working project left, and she won first, not because she'd outbuilt me, but because I'd put out my own light. My sabotage was the entire margin. The day I built mine for Real, the margin came back. I threw my switch, and my work ran the way I'd made it to run, beautiful and true, and the judges saw what the best build in the hall actually looked like when its maker didn't break it. And when the placements came down, I took first, clean, and Daphne placed ninth.
Ninth.
Not second, not third, ninth. her true level in a real field, because without my light put out to make hers look like enough, hers was just one decent project among many. She didn't place ninth because I did anything to her. She placed ninth because I stopped doing the one thing that had ever lifted her. I stopped breaking my own work, so hers would look like first. I'll tell you about the moment of truth, because in my first life I broke it, and throwing that switch for real in my second was a resurrection in the closing of a circuit. The judges came to my table, and they asked their questions, and I answered them the way you answer, when the work is real and you understand every inch of it. And then came the moment, the demonstration, the throwing of the switch, the binary honest verdict. There's a feeling in the half-second before you throw the switch that I'd forgotten across 15 gray years of idle hands, and it came back whole in that instant. The held breath, the knowledge that in one moment the world inside your head will either match the world on the table or it won't. The clean terror and clean hope of a maker about to find out the truth about her own work in front of witnesses. It is the feeling I was born for, the feeling the kitchen table gave me and Claudia tried to take, and it stood in me on that fair floor the way it had stood in me 100 times alone. And in my first life this was precisely the moment I betrayed. The moment I reached in and quietly loosened the load-bearing connection and let the circuit stay open and my light stay dark, on Claudia's word, my own best work dying on the table by my own hand. This time I left every connection solid. This time I let the moment of truth be exactly what it was born to be. I put my hand on the switch, and I felt my whole self gather behind it. The cold house kid and the kitchen table and the little lamp and Ms. Okafor's grease-stained nod and every true thing my hands had ever made, and I threw it. And then Claudia broke. It happened as the placements were announced, as my first and Daphne's ninth became undeniable, as the hall understood that the borrowed daughter had taken the fair clean and the real daughter had landed nowhere near the top. And I watched the realization move across Claudia's face in stages. I did not go to her. I want that on the record, because it's the heart of who I'd become. I didn't cross the hall and explain that Daphne had placed ninth by the exact measure of the light I'd refused, this time, to put out. I stood at my table with my work still running true, and Ms. Okafor's nod warm in my chest, and I let Claudia break, because her breaking was not a thing I had to fix, and never had been. The only thing I'd done was build my own work and decline for one fair, to break it so her daughter wouldn't have to actually be as good as me. The rest she'd done herself. The night she put a warm hand over a starving child's and dressed her own daughter's coronation up as the price of belonging. And then something happened that told me everything about what Claudia had built. Daphne came to me. Not gracious, not at first. She came with the hollow, stunned look of a girl whose whole understanding of herself had just been measured without her mother's thumb on the scale, and she said, half to herself, looking at my project still running on the table, I always place. Mom said, and she stopped, and I watched her do the arithmetic she'd never had to do. Watched something move behind her eyes, the first crack of an awareness that maybe the placings had never been quite what she thought, that maybe her mother's hands had always been on the scale, that maybe she'd never once found out, until right now, what she could actually do alone. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just a girl meeting the true measure of herself for the first time, which is a hard thing to meet at 17, and harder still to suspect that the mother who loves you arranged for you never to meet it sooner. Yours actually works, she said finally, almost wondering, looking at my running machine like it was the first honest thing she'd seen all day, and there was something under it that was nearly relief, the relief of a kid who spent her whole life uneasy about a thing she couldn't name finally seeing it named. I heard she got better after that. Once her mother's hands came off, got real, did her own work, became something she'd built herself instead of something built for her. The daughter Claudia held up as the reason to break my light turned out to be another kid Claudia had failed, just more warmly than she'd failed me. Daphne wasn't the architect. She was the daughter, placed ninth, free for the first time. Claudia came to find me a while later, not to apologize because Claudia didn't have that in her, but lost and cold and genuinely uncomprehending, and her not understanding showed me the exact shape of the thing that had nearly frozen me for good. So I told her, not the rebirth, not the gray years, not the current. The mechanism. I said, You found a starving kid, and you fed her just enough warmth to need you, and the first time your real daughter's first place was on the line, you told that kid to break her own best work, to put out her own light, so your daughter could shine, and you called it being part of the family. But Daphne was never the better builder. The only reason she ever took first was that I broke mine. My sabotage was the whole margin. The one time I built my own work and let it run, she placed ninth because that's exactly what she is in a real field without my light put out, and you've always known it. You told me yourself I was more gifted the night you told me to bomb it. I let it sit. And here's what you never understood, what you couldn't, because you only ever knew warmth as a thing you spend. A thing you build works, or it doesn't. The laws don't care whose daughter I was supposed to be, or whose feelings it hurts, or who needed the win more. The circuit closes, or it doesn't. You can manage the path and arrange the proof and feed the borrowed girl just enough to use her, but you cannot make a true thing out of a false one, and you cannot make a working machine fail for a woman who's decided to throw her switch. The one time I refused to break my light, the work told the truth, and the truth was ninth. Then the last thing, the thing I'd learned in a cold house and a warm fake kitchen and a gray grave. You weren't a mother to me. A mother doesn't hand her child a bill. I just took 15 years and a whole life to learn the difference. She didn't have an answer. There was nothing to manage. She looked at me like she was seeing, for the first time, the thing she'd spent years of borrowed warmth never having to see, that the starving girl she'd fattened to use had one thing her conditions could never reach, which was the honesty of her own hands, and that she'd just used it to take the fair clean and place the real daughter ninth, in front of everyone. And I think some cold part of her understood that she hadn't lost control of me at that fair. She'd been losing it from the moment she decided a hungry child's heart was a thing to feed and spend, rather than a thing to actually love, and the ninth place was just the moment the truth ran true on the table. She left without another word. I never broke my own work for her again. And that, more than the first place, more than Daphne's ninth, was the moment Claudia truly broke, not in the hall, where it was public, but quietly, where she finally understood that the one warmth she could never counterfeit was the only kind that counted. I took first. I want you to sit in those words, because in my first life they were the great unbearable if I carried into a cold guarded life and a death by the current, if only I'd built it, and in my second they were simply what I did. I took first at the fair, the cold house girl who outbuilt the managed daughter clean, and with it came the scholarship and the recognition that opened every door. Claudia's warmth had been the price of closing, because the one thing that had ever stood between me and my future was a light I put out, and the lesson it taught, and the moment I let it shine instead, the door I'd had no other way through opened, because the work had always been true. The years after were the years I should have had, and I want to tell you about the two things that meant the most, because there were two wounds and the second life healed both. The first was the gift. I became an engineer, of course I did. The only thing that had ever stood between me and a life of building was a woman who taught me my light was dangerous, and the moment I stopped believing her, my hands were simply mine again, quick and true the way they'd been at a kitchen table when I was 9. I built things for real, things that worked, things that mattered. I won't tell you it was easy or that the world handed it to me, because it didn't, but I made a life of throwing switches and watching true things run. The warmth I'd taught myself to make out of current and wire turned into a whole career of light. The woman who died young with idle hands on a gray job became a maker whose work was out in the world, doing the true difficult things I'd built it to do. But the second wound was the deeper one, and healing it was the real second life. Because the worst thing Claudia did wasn't closing the scholarship door. It was teaching a starving kid that warmth is a trap, that love comes with a bill, that the people who hold you closest are the ones who'll spend you, and that lesson had frozen my heart harder than my mother's cold house ever did. And the second life thawed it. Slowly, carefully, I learned the thing it took dying to be ready to learn, that real warmth exists, and that the way you tell it from the counterfeit is that it never, ever hands you a bill. Ms. Okafor's warmth had been the real kind all along. Unconditional, asking nothing, glad of my light instead of threatened by it. And once I could finally tell the difference, I let it in, and I let others in, and I built, slowly, the thing I'd never had, a found family, people who loved me with no conditions and no ledger, who were warmed by my shining instead of needing it put out. I let myself be loved without breaking anything to earn it. And I need you to understand what a miracle that was for a kid raised on conditional warmth, because the whole lie of my first life was that love and light couldn't coexist, that I had to choose between being warm and being the best. It was never true. The real ones love you more for the light, not less. That's the entire test, the only test, the test Ms. Okafor passed and Claudia failed. Some of what I came back for was never the scholarship at all. It was that being warm and bright at the same time, loved without a bill. And there was one more thing, the quietest. I never forgot what it is to be the cold house kid, starving for warmth, who gets handed just enough to be used. So, I became the warmth I'd needed and the opposite of the one I'd been given. When I found a kid like that, the hungry-hearted one with a gift, the one some grown-up was fattening to spend, I gave her the real kind. Warmth with no ledger, no conditions, no someday you'll owe me, and I told her the truth Ms. Okafor told me, that her light was hers and a thing that works works, and anyone who asks her to put it out was handing her a bill, not love. I mentored the young builders, the cold house ones, and I made sure they knew the difference between the warmth that frees you and the warmth that owns you, because some of what I came back for was them, the next starving kid with a light, who'd never be told to put it out to keep a counterfeit warm. I saw Claudia one last time, years later, and it's the truest measure of how far the two roads had run apart. I was an established engineer by then, a builder of real things, back in the old town for something, and Claudia was old, diminished, a former warm center whose warmth had curdled into a small bitter life. Daphne long grown and, I gathered, kept at a careful distance, because a love that can only feed in order to spend tends to lose the thing it feeds on. She saw me, saw the builder I'd become, the work, the standing, the unmistakable fact that the borrowed daughter she'd tried to spend had built a whole bright life she could never own a piece of, and the old complicated recognition crossed her face. She came over. She said my name, just my name, the way they always do at the end. And I waited to feel the old thing, the starving hunger for her warmth, the terror of the cold, the ache to be let back to her table. And it wasn't there. Where it had been was a clean, quiet space, because the hunger had finally, fully died, not in bitterness, but in completion, the way a starvation ends when you've been fed, at last, from tables that never sent you a bill. There was a whole warm life out there with my name on it, people who loved me free and clear, work that ran true, kids I'd warmed without conditions, and I was so completely full that there was nothing left in me to want from the woman who'd once held the only warmth I knew.
She tried to talk.
She said something about how she'd always loved me, really, how a mother has to put her own child first, how things were complicated, how she hoped I understood the position she'd been in. It was the closest Claudia could come to an apology, and it still managed to be about her. And I noticed, listening, that I didn't need it, not the apology, not the warmth, not anymore anything she had to give, because she no longer held a single thing I was hungry for. In my first life, I'd have given anything for this woman to truly be my mother, to keep her promise, to let me always have them. I'd have broken anything, put out any light, to stay at her table. But I'd built my own table years before, the day my work ran true, and the first place was mine, and I'd filled it with people who loved me free. I didn't need Claudia's warmth. I'd found the real kind, and made plenty of it, and given it away with no bill attached. So I let her finish, and I didn't argue, and I didn't accept it either. I just let it land in the air between us and dissolve. I had a real teacher once, I said, and let the pause sit before I finished, a woman named Okafor. She taught me that anyone who asks you to put out your own light to keep them warm was only ever handing you a bill. And I gave her a small, distant, final nod, not the starving, hopeful look of the girl who'd have broken anything to stay at her table. That girl was at rest now, fed at last, warm at last, gone with the cold, guarded life and the gray current of a death that no longer counts. And then I went back to my own life, my own work, my own warm table of people who loved me free, and I left Claudia holding the memory of a girl she'd told to break her light, who had instead let it shine and taken everything in the open. I think about that kitchen table sometimes. The cocoa, the warm hand over mine, the line, bomb the science fair so my daughter takes first, do it for the family and you'll always have us. and how in one life I obeyed and broke my own best work with my own hands and put out my own light and froze for 15 years and died young and unwarmed, and in another life I refused and threw my switch and let it shine. The whole divergence of two lives, the difference between a builder dying with idle hands and a builder whose true work runs in the world, came down to a single word at a warm false table.
No.
The smallest word, and the truest thing I ever built. I've lived both answers now, the obedient breaking and the steady no, and I can tell you exactly what each one costs and what each one buys. The breaking costs you everything and feels in the moment, like love, like loyalty, like being a good girl, like the price of belonging to the one warm family you ever found. And the no costs you a counterfeit warmth and a promise that was never real, and feels, in the moment, like selfishness and ingratitude and the loss of the only mother you ever had, and buys you back your hands, your light, your whole frozen heart, and a life full of the real warmth that never sends a bill. That's the trap, the entire machinery of it. They arrange the world so that breaking yourself feels like love and keeping yourself feels like betrayal. And the only way out is to have died once already inside the breaking, to have felt your hands go idle and your heart go cold, and to know in your bones that the warmth was a bill and the love was a leash, and to throw your switch anyway and let your own true work shine. I had to lose a whole life to learn the difference between the warmth that frees you and the warmth that spends you. I'm telling you, every starving-hearted kid who's ever been fed just enough to be used, so that maybe you won't have to. People think revenge has to be loud. I thought so too. In the dark after my first death, the confrontations, the exposures, the satisfying ruin. But the most complete revenge I ever took was to throw my own switch and let my work run true while the woman who told me to break it discovered, at ninth place, what her daughter was worth without a better builder putting out her own light. I never raised my voice except to say no. I never did a thing to Daphne. I just built my own work and let it tell the truth. And it turned out the whole thing. Daphne's first place, Claudia's warm pride, all of it, had only ever been standing on my willingness to break my own light, and the one time I refused, the truth came out, and the truth was a thing that ran, and a daughter placed ninth. I've thought a great deal, across two lives, about the particular kind of warmth Claudia used on me, because it's the cruelest weapon there is against a person who's never had enough of it, and almost no one names how it works. The cold ones, the ones who simply have no warmth to give, they wound you, but cleanly, you know where you stand, you build your scar tissue, you move on. It's the warm ones who do the real damage, the ones who give you exactly enough to need them and then attach a price to keeping it, because they teach you that love itself is a transaction, that affection is a thing you earn by being useful and lose by being yourself, that the warmth will be withdrawn the moment you stop paying. And here is the thing it took me dying to understand, the thing I'd tell every starving-hearted kid who's ever been fed just enough to be spent. The test of real warmth is brutally simple, and it's the one Ms. Okafor passed and Claudia failed every day without my ever noticing. Real warmth never hands you a bill. It doesn't keep a ledger. It isn't withdrawn when you shine. It's gladdened by your shining, because the people who actually love you are warmed by your light, not threatened by it, and they would no sooner ask you to put it out than ask you to stop breathing. The counterfeit kind asks you to dim yourself for its comfort and calls that love. The real kind asks you to shine as bright as you possibly can and calls that joy. And the most insidious part of the counterfeit is how it dresses the ask. Never as a price, never as a transaction, always as family, as love, as the thing a good girl does for the people who took her in. So no, I don't feel a flicker of guilt that Daphne placed ninth. I did nothing to Daphne. I just stopped breaking my own light for a warmth that was only ever a bill and a mother's clothing, and let myself shine, for once, as bright as my hands could make me. Refusing to put out your own light is not selfishness toward the people who warmed you. It only feels that way to the ones who are only ever warming you to spend. The people who ask you to put out your own light to keep them warm and call it family are almost always the ones who needed you dark. I broke my own best work once, for a warmth that was never mine, and I died young and frozen with my hands gone idle. I won't break my own light again. Not in this life, and if there's another after it, not in that one either. I'm building my own work most days now, in a warm life full of people who love me free. My hands quick and true the way they were at a kitchen table when I was 9. The light I taught myself to make out of current, and wire given away to everyone who wants it. And every time I close a circuit and throw a switch and watch a true thing come alive, I think about the girl who broke her own best work for a counterfeit warmth, who put out her own light and froze for it and died young in the cold. And I'm so grateful she got the chance to do it differently. Because that girl at the fair didn't just win back a scholarship. She won back the build, the switch, the moment of truth, the light she taught herself to make, the one honest place that was always unarguably hers, and the simple, total, hard-won fact of being a maker who throws her switch and lets her work shine, instead of a girl who breaks her own light, so someone's managed daughter doesn't have to be as good as she is. And she never, ever, put out her own light again. I died the first time with my own best work broken by my own hands, frozen and idle, killed by the current I once commanded, alone and unwarmed at the end. I intend to die the second time an old woman who threw every switch she ever built, with a life of true running things behind her and a warm, crowded table of people who loved me free, my hands still quick and the light still mine. And if the current comes for me again at the end, some last circuit I can't get clear of, let it find me having built my own work and let it shine. Every time, all the way down. Same light, both ends of two lives. The first time it was the phantom of everything I broke, a thing I made, and then ruined with my own hands at a false mother's word. This time it's the real thing, everything I kept, the switch thrown and the circuit closed, and the true thing running, mine in the open for good. And the only thing that ever stood between the two was a single word, at a warm false table, said level and unafraid to the woman who told me to break my light. No.